Welcome everyone to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's 26th meeting of 2020. Before we start, I just want to put on record we have apologies from Finlay Carson, and he's been substituted this morning by John Scott. Our first item today is the evidence session on the Scottish Government's budget for 2021-2022 with the Cabinet Secretary for the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform and the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform, Rosanna Cunningham, is joined by government officials Kirsty Berg, Director of Energy and Climate Change, Simon Fuller, the Deputy Director for the Rural Environmental Science and Analytical Services, and Alistair Mitchell, Deputy Director of Aquaculture and Recreational Fisheries. Kate Forbes is joined by Scottish Government officials Judy McLaren, Deputy Director of Public Spending, and Rachel Gwynne, the Deputy Director for Infrastructure and Investment Division. Good morning to you all. I'll start questioning off. I think I'd like to direct this at the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. First of all, as a general question, as you set the budget for this year and next, you've got very costly objectives dealing with the COVID-related economic crisis, our health service requiring resources to take us through the pandemic. But looming large in the background is potentially the larger crisis of climate change and our obligations in statute to reach net zero by 2045, and probably the more challenging target of the 75% reduction by 2030. So as we recover economically, as we try to save jobs, create new jobs, we have to do it in line with those climate change and emissions obligations across portfolio. What is your thinking in financing a green economic recovery coherently across government portfolios, public agencies and local authorities? Ms Forbes.
Thanks very much, and thanks to the committee for the time this morning. I think the last sentence that you stated, that around coherence, is actually the only way that we're able to do this. So as you can imagine, and as you outlined, these are hugely challenging issues. So from a budgetary perspective, you'll certainly have heard me over the last few weeks talk consistently about the challenges to our budget and the increased uncertainty right now of the UK government scrapping its autumn budget. And the reason why that's a concern is because it doesn't give us the precise figures that we need to set a budget. So we have these growing and significant demands on the budget, whether, as you said, it's COVID related or it's Brexit related, or it is now indeed the bigger challenge of ensuring that our budget supports our climate change ambitions, because these targets are hugely ambitious, and I think every MSP and every member of this country needs to appreciate just how ambitious and challenging they are. And there isn't additional budget, as it were, sitting alongside our core budget in order to deliver that. So we have to make sure that we're delivering our climate change ambitions within our budget, and the only way to do that is to make sure that right across the government we're integrated and coherent in what we are trying to do. So in terms of how we're doing that, as demonstrated in our last budget and successive programmes for government and our infrastructure investment plan, we are still very much committed to tackling the twin threats of climate change and biodiversity loss. And our commitment to a just transition to net zero emissions was already clear in the last budget, where you saw low carbon infrastructure investments increase by over 500 million to £1.8 billion. But in terms of this year's budget, there's been the recent commitment to the £2 billion capital investment over the next 5 years in transformative net zero projects. And if you look at the themes for the programme for government, those will inform our budget. And one of those themes was very much new, good and green jobs. So that will inform future budget decisions alongside our statutory obligations. When it comes to the capital spending review framework and the draft infrastructure investment plan, which obviously are critical when it comes to delivering our climate change ambitions, those have already been planned as a coherent and a strategic framework. And enabling the transition to net zero emissions and environmental sustainability is one of the core 3 aims. So that's maybe just a quick run through that whilst there are a number of challenges that we're facing, we haven't lost sight of our ambitions on climate change. The only way we can deliver is by being integrated and coherent across government. And the two documents that you'll have already seen, which will inform next year's budget in terms of the CSR and the infrastructure investment plan, I hope you'll agree, show a coherent approach to that.
Ms Forbes, you might have seen evidence that we've heard over the last few weeks on the green recovery. And time again, the people who have given evidence have come back with a top line on what they see being a priority with regards to the green recovery, and that is upskilling, retraining, training young people as well for these low carbon jobs, as well as the innovation that's actually going to provide those jobs. You mentioned Brexit, and a lot of the funding that we have traditionally had in Scotland for training programmes, for innovation, has come from the likes of Horizon 2020. That's obviously coming to an end. How has that gap been filled, or is it been filled?
Yeah, so on that, the first element in terms of evidence about new jobs and green jobs, I agree with that evidence completely. And again, it comes to that point where if we're going to be investing in transition funding, for example, if we're going to be investing in economic recovery, let's make sure we do it in a sustainable way. And I'd again refer you back to the programme for government, which will inform this year's budget, when it came to the £100 million Green Industry and Jobs Fund. And that is to support businesses which provide sustainable or low carbon products and services to develop, grow, and ultimately to create jobs. And the other one to draw your attention to was the Transition Training Fund, so 25 million Transition Training Fund, which includes a focus on provision for green skills. So, you know, that point around coherence and building it in is the only way that I can see from a budgetary perspective that we're able to make that possible. In terms of EU funding, we are still waiting for clarity on future arrangements for replacing EU funding. We need a clear statement from the UK government on future funding for all aspects covered by EU funding, and that includes Horizon 2020. Our expectation is that there is full replacement of EU funding from the end of December to ensure that there is no detriment to Scotland's public finances. As you can imagine, it's one of the significant risks I see on the horizon when it comes to setting our budget and ensuring that we can continue to invest in the areas that we believe are important. And that's why, you know, and there's been a lot of ink spilt on this and a lot of debate, but it was really disappointing to learn with no prior notice that the UK government had written provisions on financial assistance into the internal market bill that presume Whitehall control over the delivery of replacements for EU funding programmes in Scotland. And these are, you know, programmes that Scottish ministers have delivered successfully for decades. And it does mean that with less control, it becomes more challenging to set a budget that continues to invest in the innovation that we believe is important, or in higher education and research and development. So I'm afraid I've got no other clearer answer than to say that it's an area which continues to pose a risk when it comes to continuing to invest in these areas of importance.
And maybe I can bring in the Cabinet Secretary for the Environment and Climate Change here, because one of the issues, of course, in terms of coherence, is that coherence is actually built right across not just government portfolios, but down to public agencies and local authorities as well. You know, the climate change crisis, the biodiversity crisis. I mean, from your perspective, how can we ensure that coherence goes right down to like local authority level and public agency level?
Yes, can I just pick up on off the back of Kate Forbes talking about the situation with the EU replacement funds, because I, as the committee knows, attend regular interministerial meetings with DEFRA devolved administration counterparts, and the issue of the so-named Shared Prosperity Fund has been something which we have questioned on repeatedly, and still have absolutely no real clarity on, despite the fact that this is something that was flagged up, I think we're now into years ago. So there is a high degree of anxiety about what is actually going to happen, what is actually going to be available. And it does then have a roll-on impact into the kinds of decision-making about where and in how and in what fashion we will be able to fund things, because we are not clear where and how much money is actually coming. And that does impact not just the whole of government, but it obviously impacts very much individual portfolios like mine. And that then takes us on to the question of how we manage the whole process of ensuring that public agencies and local authorities are as well equipped as they possibly can be to meet the challenges that we are all going to have to face. I mean, obviously, public bodies are at the front line of our whole response, both in terms of climate emergency and in terms of biodiversity. And already a lot of them are going beyond the very strict statutory duties that they have to try and ensure that we get this absolutely right. So, that's incredibly important to understand, that public bodies are working out and beyond strict statutory duties to do that. We're also working very closely with local authorities, because I'm conscious as much as anybody that local authorities have a tremendous role to play in all of this, and the whole public sector really, which is why we have been so keen to try and ramp up the public sector bodies' duties to make sure that the whole public sector is actually on board in respect of this. So obviously there are new requirements on public bodies to contribute towards our national target, and that expectation that public bodies will deliver zero carbon emissions, and that they must tell us what their target date for that is an expectation that we have of them. But obviously the ability to ensure that they are properly funded in order to be able to make those decisions is incredibly important. They're going to have to align their own spending plans and use of resources in a way that we are having to do through central government. We're asking public bodies, the whole of the public sector, to think along the same sorts of lines that we're having to think about now in terms of the way they manage things. And we've also put money into help decarbonise the public sector estate, and that money, that £95 million, is committed for the 2021 budget. And there are other things that we can do, but there is no doubt that the financial challenge that we face as a government is a financial challenge that the whole of the public sector, whether it be public bodies or local government or whoever, will actually face as a whole. And we can do as much as we can do and encourage the kind of alignment that we're talking about in Scottish Government way of working, to ensure that they are all thinking along those same lines.
Ms Cunningham, there's another layer, isn't there, underneath that, and that's communities as well. And quite a few of our the people that have been in front of us have talked about the loss of leader funding as well, because obviously communities are delivering a lot, particularly in biodiversity. Was this something that you hoped the Shared Prosperity Fund would fill in?
Well, I think the difficulty with the Shared Prosperity Fund is that we never really got much of a definition as to what it was actually supposed to replace. We presumed that it was a sort of catch-all in terms of where EU funding was, but we never really got that and haven't had that detail, despite requesting, despite asking. I think that's just unfortunate that we're in that space. But yes, LEADER is a very significant source of funding at quite a granular level, and it, you know, at the moment we still do not have any understanding of where that kind of replacement funding will come from, and that makes it very difficult for everybody to plan. It makes it very difficult to be thinking about what is possible and what is not possible without that understanding.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to questions from Mark Ruskell. Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Kavina. Morning, everybody. I wanted to ask about the infrastructure investment plan. Kate Forbes, you just mentioned it in your introductory remarks there. And it seems to me that what is needed right now is a real step change in thinking, particularly after the Infrastructure Commission for Scotland's recommendations, the very challenging targets we've got for 2030 now as well in terms of climate change. Can you illustrate how a step change in thinking is happening around infrastructure at the moment, and particularly if there are particular projects, such as road building projects or others, which have been reprioritised or maybe dropped in the draft IEP?
Thanks. I think that when it comes to the infrastructure investment plan, there is definitely a step change. Obviously, it's in consultation form just now, so there's an open invitation for people to provide feedback. But in terms of the plan, it builds on the Commission's advice, and it bakes in to that our approach to infrastructure over the next 5 years. So, you know, it will not just, opposed to Gillian Martin's earlier question, it won't just help us to deliver economic recovery, but it also has shown how we've changed our approach to whether that's choosing the right investments. It introduces a new infrastructure investment hierarchy. It places a much greater emphasis on maintaining, enhancing and repurposing what we have, rather than creating new things. So you'll see, for example, that the aim to double spending on maintenance over the next 5 years. Now, that might not be the glamorous headline, but I think that demonstrates a significant step change in terms of our approach to building new things rather than maintaining what we had. The IIP, it also sets out the need to consider future climate change impacts when adapting existing assets or planning new assets. So, for example, you'll see new money for flood risk management and adapting to change at our coasts caused by climate change. So I would say that the draft plan is a significant step change. It recognises the role that Scotland's natural environment needs to play in our infrastructure system, and it also shows, I think, for the first time, a significant move away from just building new to actually maintenance, and that we know creates jobs, whilst at the same time is far less carbon intensive.
Mm-hmm. But has there been any infrastructure projects, though, that have been reprioritised as a result of that thinking? I'm thinking in particular road.
Sorry. Well, when it comes to the infrastructure investment plan, when it comes to any budget, we start with a position of knowing what our budgetary constraints are, and then take an approach within that funding envelope. And the very fact that we have chosen to invest in, and I could list it now, but including the £2 billion of low carbon projects, the very fact that we have chosen to invest in that will mean that there are many other things that I'm sure Mark's constituents write to him about and my constituents write to me about, other forms of infrastructure that won't be able to proceed. So, you know, rather than making a list just now, I think the very fact that in that plan you've got more than £8 billion for environmental sustainability, including £250 million to support 18,000 hectares of forestry and restoring peatlands, means that that's £250 million that won't be spent elsewhere. And I'd certainly like to focus more on what we are doing than what we aren't doing.
Sorry, does that mean then that there are things that are in the IIP that will be deprioritised over time? So is there a kind of hierarchy within the IIP of low carbon spending? I'm not quite clear on that. Is there a sort of reserve list of projects that probably won't get built then?
No, so the IIP is based on the best available evidence we have right now, because obviously we don't include projects in the IIP that we can't fund. So starting with the capital spending review, that gives us our envelope for the next 5 years of what funding we might have available. Now, the challenge this year is that we're doing it on the best available evidence that we have, because we're going ahead of the UK government publishing what we hope will be their spending review in autumn, but that's up in the air. So we don't include in the IIP projects that we know we can't fund. We include projects that we know we will be able to fund. So everything included within the IIP just now, we know that we can fund. Then building on that, we've taken on board the Commission's findings, and we have built a package that is based on the Commission's findings, including the transition to net zero. And that has directly informed our decision to include £500 million over the next 5 years in active travel, £1.6 billion over the next 5 years to decarbonise heat, £75 million to improve local authority recycling, increasing forest cover, which I've just mentioned. So these are all projects contained because we know that we can fund them. Okay.
You mentioned earlier about the direction of travel, and that I think last year the percentage of low carbon spend was quite relatively high compared to previous years. But at the moment, I think Kirsty Burge told us last week that it's about 36%. So 36% of the infrastructure spend is on low carbon. The rest will be medium or high carbon. Do you see a need to really increase that over time? And we've had recommendations to this committee previously that should be up to 70%, maybe higher than that, to get us on that trajectory so we're not locking in emissions for the generations to come. What's your current thinking on setting a target for low carbon infrastructure and really pinning that down? Because it doesn't seem clear in the IIP at the moment. I'm not sure if Rosanna Cunningham would like to answer that, or if Kate Forbes would like to answer.
Well, I don't mind saying something, but one of the issues here is that we are talking right across government now, not just within very particular parameters. So the way that Kate Forbes spoke about this, you need to remember that lots and lots of what is potentially what government can do will be in the arena of absolute expectation by communities. Now, there are things in there that are probably things that we've been hoping to be able to do for some time. They may be medium to high carbon. It would not be possible, I don't believe, to effectively get to a 100% low carbon early. And I think we need to focus on where we are here, because we're not going to be able to do that straight away. What we're trying to do is to get as much as possible into the low carbon sector as soon as possible, and work on some of the rest. That's where our medium-term target of 2030 is really important, as well as the 2045 target. So we're trying to corral as much as possible into the low carbon category, and work as hard as we can in the other areas to ensure that more and more of that is low carbon as we go through into the medium and longer term. So it's really not a question about right now. It's a question about how we get there. We haven't discussed the issue of potential targets on that. Scotland has more targets than virtually any other country in the world. Not entirely sure that yet another one would necessarily help in these circumstances, but it's certainly a discussion that we can have. in respect of low carbon investment. It wouldn't necessarily be a particularly easy one to have, because I think, as Mark Ruskell knows, there will be some sectors where it's more easily achieved than in other sectors, and that's just a reality in which we live. And also, we cannot see into the future sufficiently to know where the newer technologies will make a big difference and not. And there may be some sectors where there will be some significant shifts that allow a much greater emphasis in terms of low carbon than in other sectors. So it's a slightly complicated area, probably one worth having a conversation about. But at this point, I'm not entirely certain whether trying to parade another set of targets is necessarily the best way to go about it.
Could I come into that as well, if that's okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. The other point, I think that targets don't help with some of the challenges around taxonomy. So in terms of that initial assessment, initial estimate of the IIP projects, which Mark Ruskell mentioned, there's a number of reasons why that figure is quite crude, or it's a partial estimate of the actual savings. So it doesn't quantify the overall change in emissions. It doesn't capture all emission savings measures, particularly those in the neutral category. So, for example, would you categorise digitalisation or digital connectivity as low carbon or not? In one sense, it will deliver some emission savings if people are working from home. But on the other hand, it's not currently classified as low carbon. And the committee will know that the independent research that was facilitated by Climate Exchange was published alongside the publication of the draft IIP. And I think the committee got a copy of that. And they themselves recognise it's a relatively new area of policy and methodological development. So it identified 4 different types of assessment that would be relevant to infrastructure investment decisions. Now, the IIP consultation invites views on the approach that we could take when it comes to actually classifying the emissions. So I think before you get into the world of targets, you need to know what you're measuring, and you need to know that your taxonomy works.
Yeah. Maybe just finally, convener, I mean, that's an interesting discussion.
Claudia Beamish. We can make this a short question because Claudia wants to come in.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, the Infrastructure Commission was quite clear, though, that the IIP really does need to nail this. So whether it's targets or whether it's some other kind of assessment, are you absolutely clear that the IIP that's being put forward will actually deliver the 2030 carbon target? Is there clarity as to what these projects that are in the infrastructure investment plan will deliver, and whether they're locking in emissions or not? Because that's the bottom line, isn't it? Are we actually going to get there?
Will I jump in? So in terms of, from a budgetary perspective, no single area of government can deliver those saving targets in isolation. It's got to be something that cuts across government. So the infrastructure investment plan, including the significant £2 billion that have been set aside, I believe will make progress, and it will contribute significantly towards our targets, but it won't do it on its own. So that's where, right across government, we need to look at how we embed those targets right across our spend. But I do think that the £1.6 billion over the next 5 years to decarbonise heat in buildings will make a significant impact. I do think that the investment that we're proposing to spend on forestry and on peatlands will make an impact. But will it do it just on its own? No. So that's why all of these have to be seen as planks in our policy and our approach to achieving what are very, very ambitious targets.
Thank you. Can I bring in Claudia Beamish?
Thank you very much, convener, and good morning to both Cabinet Secretaries and officials. Could I ask particularly perhaps of yourself, Rosanna Cunningham, to share with us your thoughts about both green infrastructure, such as the development of the National Ecological Network, and also blue infrastructure. To give an example of an area, the Scottish canals, which are in need of support like so much else. But I wonder if you might just give us your thoughts about green and blue infrastructure. Thank you.
I know Claudia has had a long-standing interest in the blue infrastructure, for sure. I think all of that is important. Sometimes we get caught up in definitions of what is and is not infrastructure, what is and is not, what can and cannot be included in capital spend as opposed to resource and all the rest of it. So sometimes there are some real technical issues in and around that. I hope that, for example, Claudia noticed that we've now made a commitment to the pocket forest idea in Scotland. That was a programme for government commitment, which I don't know whether or not she would think about that in terms of infrastructure, but obviously that begins to create biodiversity pockets in lots of areas that might not otherwise be happening, and will hopefully be part of some of the joining up argument that I know is very, very important. It is not something right now. I mean, we have not been thinking about it so much in those terms as in terms of what can deliver for emissions and for biodiversity, rather than perhaps the terms that she is currently coming from. And I just I mean, it's built into so much of what we do. I mean, and after all, the government's commitment to this has gone on for a very long time. So the Central Scotland Green Network, which of course is a huge ecological network, remains, I think, the largest in the whole of Europe. So we are still there. There are huge financial issues around some aspects of this. Claudia Beamish mentioned Scottish canals, and that sits in the transport portfolio, but is an area I think that most people will begin to see, and it does actually tie in with the Central Scotland Green Network as well. But there are big issues around the early conversation that we had about financing. So there are some good things that are happening in this area, and I would point to the pocket forest idea as one of those. And I would like to be able to do a lot more of that. But again, that comes back to two things. First of all, having the money to do it. But secondly, also having the ability to measure the outcomes from it. And that is something, so we've been talking a little bit about in terms of the infrastructure plan there. The ability to actually measure outcomes can sometimes be slightly problematic in terms of some of these proposals. I know officials at the moment are working quite hard to see if we can begin to put better quantification onto the biodiversity benefit from peatland restoration, because it's not as easy to quantify that as it is to quantify the emissions reduction side of things. So there are some issues in and around that from our perspective in terms of making sure that the money spent actually delivers what it is that you want it to deliver. So that ties in with the conversation we've just had in terms of the broader infrastructure idea, but also in terms of some of the things that come up in respect of what Claudia is asking about.
Okay, continuing.
I'm sure you'd agree, Kevin, that all the sorry, convener. It was a quick question. Is that all right?
Yeah, I'll come to Stuart. Thank you.
That all the issues that you've highlighted and which are so important to our committee, in terms of the assessment of their value, it'll also be about the high-skilled jobs that are created often in quite challenged communities, and also the well-being aspects for people as well.
Oh, I do not disagree, I mean some of the nature-based stuff that we're doing will obviously deliver jobs, massive numbers, well, not massive perhaps, but significant jobs in areas that don't otherwise have that capacity. It is absolutely the case. But if we're doing the kind of scoring that we're talking about in the earlier conversation, there are some parts of that are difficult to assign that very clear scoring to, and that becomes then a question of balance and judgment in where you make your decisions to put your money. So that is, you know, that is just a reality for all of us in the current circumstances.
Thank you. Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Convener. It's a simple question for the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. The word innovation has come up a number of times in this evidence session, and I just want to see if the Cabinet Secretary, recognising that innovation comes at greater risk than routine investments, is she prepared to tolerate a degree of failure in innovation? And I put that against the background of having spent 30 years professionally in innovation, where I generate 5 to 10% of my annual expenditure, which was of tens of millions of pounds, to be in projects that would ultimately not deliver on their objectives, but might deliver on increasing our understanding of what not to do in future. So is the Cabinet Secretary prepared to contemplate that innovation brings with it some failure, and that we must manage that failure appropriately? Thanks.
Thanks. I mean, I obviously have a duty and a responsibility to make sure that every penny that we invest is well spent. But I think Stuart Stevenson makes a very important point, which is that at this time of huge change and uncertainty, we need innovation. We need people to be pioneering new solutions to help us solve some of these very difficult problems. And I've got responsibility for digital alongside finance, and responsibility for developing our new AI strategy. So one of the first things that we did was set up a fund, which was the AI for Good fund, to try and invite bids for funding for innovative solutions that may or may not work out, but to try and support the private sector in developing these solutions. And I think, that's where the Scottish National Investment Bank can really come into its own, because it will obviously be formally established later this year. But the bank will have that core mission when it comes to the transition to net zero, and they're going to have to invest in organisations, enterprises, research and development and ideas that will help us transition. We don't have all the ready-made solutions at this point, and therefore that investment will hopefully drive the innovation that he talks about. And I have no doubt that when it comes to innovation, its very definition suggests that it won't all be a rip-roaring success.
Now, a number of members will want to pick up on innovation and the financing of it later on in the session. I'll come to Ms Cunningham.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in a slightly more general point here. The Sustainable Renewal Advisory Group is beginning to talk about a kind of learning by doing approach to some of this, which obviously innovation isn't just about technical innovation and technological innovation. It's also about innovation in methodology and innovation in areas like that. So I wouldn't want us to get too tied up with it just being about technological innovation. It's not. And the broader idea that we have to accept a kind of learning by doing almost carries with it that implicit understanding that there are times when the learning will be that it doesn't work. And we can't then run around with our hair on fire behaving as if that's an absolute disaster, because the point about learning is that we will be learning better ways of doing, and in some cases that will almost of necessity involve parking ideas because the doing part showed us it was simply not going to work. So there's two things. First of all, the learning by doing does imply that there will be some things that don't work. But secondly, let's not get so hung up on innovation that we're only talking about technological innovation, because innovation can be much more wide than that, and it can be about how we do things as opposed to what we do them with, which bits of kit we do them with.
Thank you, Ms Cunningham. I was going to say that we are going to dig into innovation and the financing of it later on in the session. For now, I'm going to hand over to John Scott, who's going to talk about nature-based solutions to our recovery. John.
Thank you, Convener. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. And can I begin by declaring an interest as a farmer, given that I was going to talk about the nature-based solutions to recovery. And in that regard, I would like to talk about particularly agriculture, having declared an interest, and refer members to my interest in the register with regard to that. One of the questions that I would particularly like to ask at the outset is about the funding, the Sustainable Capital Grant Scheme. I'm not sure if this is a question for the Kate Forbes or Rosanna, but of the £40 million announced, £20 million has not been allocated in that scheme, and indeed only £10 million of that scheme has been allocated thus far to farmers, and indeed it closes, I think, this weekend, the bids for that scheme, which is a very short window of application. Can someone give a bit more information about when the remainder of that money will be allocated? I'd be very keen to know that, please, to allow farmers to get on with doing doing what they want to do, which is very much play their part in helping to reduce, move us all towards net zero. Maybe to you first, Rosanna. I don't know, or Kate.
Well, Convener, if I could just say that I'm not familiar about the detail of that particular grant scheme that John Scott is asking about. Obviously, that would lie within Fergus Ewing's portfolio. I think rather than me begin to try and construct an answer for John that might be unintentionally misleading, I think if I could simply get that relayed to the Rural Economy CABSEC for a more specific and detailed response in early doors, that would perhaps, from my perspective, be a better way of doing it, rather than trying to pretend that I know more about this than I actually do. It's a very specific sum of money, a very specific scheme, and I think probably Fergus Ewing is in a better position to be able to give the detail that John Scott's looking for.
John, have you any the more general nature-based solutions that might be in the budget?
Yeah, I would like to very much ask, having got that specific one off my chest, I would very much like to ask, if I may, about the nature-based solutions, carbon reduction schemes that you have in mind, and how you're going to see those development and enhance natural capital through all of these things. I'm particularly interested in peatland restoration, that sort of thing. I'm also interested in forestry. How do you see yourself striking a balance across all these land use issues? And is there any sign of the third land use strategy being developed? But for my part, I want to see working landscapes with people in these landscapes, and that has always been my ambition, and I think it's one that I believe it's one that the Cabinet Secretary for the Environment shares as well. But how do you see these developing and rolling out? Can
I welcome John Scott back to the committee? But his absence from the committee suggests that he is not absolutely aware of the shudder of apprehension going through his colleagues at the moment at any invitation to allow me to start talking about peatland restoration, which they will know has been a very particular issue that I have been hugely enthusiastic about. So I will try to moderate my views on that. I think that the peatland restoration and combined with the tree planting targets are obviously at the moment the two biggest and most significant of the nature-based recovery programs that we're talking about, and have the capacity to deliver enormously in terms of emissions reductions, but also in terms of biodiversity and local rural jobs. Peatland restoration particularly does open up very significant possibilities, and there, we will have to be looking very, very carefully right across the whole of Scotland. I think there's a tendency for people to think that tree planting and peatland are about, the Highlands, and they're about areas that are very far away. But SNH has a map of Scotland that can show you just how widespread peat is, and there will be many farmers who will have corners and areas of their land that are able to be used for tree planting and for peatland restoration. I know John Scott has previously had a very particular concern about whether or not we would have the financial tools available to allow farmers to link all of that up. And that's going to be a very important part of it. There will be some easy wins in terms of forestry and peatland restoration, and obviously some of the larger landscape area estates, whether, no matter what ownership they're in, might give us some of the quick and easy wins. But we need to do all of it, and that will include the discussions with farmers like John Scott about how to manage the delivery of gains, even in areas that don't belong on the big Highland estates, which is what, of course, most people think about when they think about peatland. So I know that John Scott is very particularly interested in the financial tools that might or might not be available to allow this to happen. I hope that the huge commitment that we made in terms of, multi-year funding for this kind of thing reassures him that we are looking at how this can best be delivered, and that will include direct conversations with landowners, large and small, including farmers, as to what might be deliverable. So, and also it does go into the much wider area of land use in general. There's a lot of work being done by the Scottish Land Commission in this area, and they're in the lead for developing proposals, and I'm hoping that they are imminently going to be publishing the next set of proposals. The next land use strategy will be consulted on, the third land use strategy, in accordance with the legislative requirements, and it will very much focus on the challenges that we're going to be facing in the next 5 to 10 years, and the role that land use and land use change can play. And I hope that we will be able to talk about regional land use partnerships in the context of that strategy.
John, do you have anything further, or can I go to Liz Smith?
Is that, well, can I just say one more thing? I mean, if there's there seems to be a shortfall in allocation of that £20 million. Do you see that being and going into the land use partnerships and the land use strategy? Is that what the budget allocation is for? or is that one for Fergus again?
I'm sorry. Are we back to that particular grant fund?
Well, I suppose I am, yes. I mean, you took me back there by talking about the financial tools and the need to support farmers in doing that, as you talked about, in the corners of their farms, as well as in larger pieces of land on the estates. But is that where do you see that money being spent in the budget?
Well, it's not coming from within my portfolio. It's not a fund over which I have control. I think we will add that to the questioning for Fergus Ewing. I'm not certain that particular fund is directed towards that, but I think that's the kind of thing that we need to get certainty from Fergus about.
Okay, thanks, Rosanna.
Thank you. Can I come to Liz Smith?
Thank you, Convener. Could I just direct one question, first of all, to Kate Forbes? You spoke earlier in your introductory remarks about coherence, which is obviously very important, and the regional land use partnerships are very much part of that. I was just wondering, given the questions that we've had from a lot of stakeholders, specifically, how will these partnerships be funded? Where's that money coming from? Which part of the budget?
I presume you're talking about next year's budget.
Yes.
Yeah. So in terms of next year's budget, that will be we've started off the budget process just now, and that will be as part of the discussions over the next few weeks and months, as per the normal budget process, and what our overall spending envelope is within each portfolio, and then that's how we make decisions about where funding comes from.
Right, but just given what you said about the coherence and that being absolutely vital across all the budget area, I mean, obviously there are very strong competing interests across the environment brief and across the rural affairs brief from this. And these, as I understand it, these partnerships are extremely important for central to government policy, and they're obviously generally very popular with the stakeholders, but they are wanting to know where the money would come from in order to fund that. So do you have any ideas about where you think that envelope of money might be?
At this precise moment, I can't give you an answer, largely because there's still a budget process to go through, which is particularly uncertain this year. But I do understand the concerns and the fact that communities are keen to know where that funding might come from.
Could we just have a reassurance from you that these partnerships are absolutely central to Scottish Government policy in terms of helping to manage the land effectively, but obviously to need the cooperation and coherence that we've been looking for? Can I just have that assurance on the record?
Yeah, so we are committed to the establishment of regional land use partnerships, and as a first step, as you'll know, we've asked the Scottish Land Commission to take the lead on developing proposals and to make recommendations to Scottish ministers, so hopefully that's quite clear.
And just from the perspective of natural assets, Scotland is so rich in all of that, whether it's tourism, aquaculture, fishing, forestry, farming, you name it, and tourism particularly. And that's something I think your colleague Rosanna Cunningham has just indicated earlier, that there are a significant number of green jobs to come in these areas. Does the Scottish Government have any projections of the increase in the number of green jobs in that natural asset area?
Is that one for me?
Sorry,
Rosanna?
I'm not sure who you want to answer that question. There will be very specific projections, I think, in some areas, but not in all. When you're talking about natural assets, it can be a hugely wide category. In terms of the kind of figures that might be deliverable from the forestry commitment and the peatland restoration commitment, we're working to quantify that right now. It's a difficult one to do because until this point we didn't have the multi-year commitment, and therefore we are, by delivering a multi-year commitment, we are also delivering the potential for capacity growth, and being able to envisage forward what that capacity growth will actually deliver in terms of jobs is uncertain. Peatland restoration really is just beginning. This is the time of year when it starts. and this would be the first year where contractors, for example, would know that they will be able to plan for that longer period, and we're looking very closely at how that is going to look in terms of jobs growth. So the specific numbers in some areas it would be quite difficult. Other areas there may very well be some more defined figures. Let's remember that we're talking over quite a significant period of time for particularly for nature-based recovery investment. We're talking over 10 years, and we would expect job growth over that period to increase year on year, but also in areas where there aren't that many good jobs at the moment. That's really important. For obvious reasons, tourism is facing different, very significant challenges, and although arguably it is an economic sector which is very much derived from Scotland's natural assets, it's nevertheless facing very, very serious challenges right now because of the pandemic, and I wouldn't want to hazard a guess as to how that currently looks, and how and in what way that would be projected forwards in terms of jobs. We have got work currently being done by, for example, Nature Scotland, Nature Scot, to try and begin to quantify where some of this job growth will come from on the nature-based side of things, and that is work that is ongoing in terms of quantifying, insofar as we are able to do that. But it is where there will be money spent, because it's incredibly important. So I'm hoping, for example, that the commitment over 10 years for peatland restorations mean that contractors may feel confident enough then to take on modern apprentices, to begin to do the kind of training, knowing that those jobs will be in existence for some very considerable time. At the moment, they are only just beginning to ramp up, and it's very early days for them.
Yeah, that's a very helpful answer. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Just on that point, Kate Forbes, obviously Rosanna Cunningham is flagging up that it's a difficult calculation in some cases, not least because of the length of time that it can take to see where the outcomes might be most beneficial. And I just wondered how you plan ahead for future budgets in relation to that development and that level of growth. I mean, do you have a way of ensuring that the budget planning ahead for green jobs, which everybody has identified as being so important, is very carefully laid out in terms of what the projected outcomes will be beneficially to the employment market?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in terms of taking a step back, how we plan ahead for any budget, we use obviously the medium-term financial strategy. So our commitment was to publish the medium-term financial strategy alongside this year's budget, and obviously the medium-term financial strategy is a 5-year outlook on our budget planning. So that's where some of these decisions would be taken in terms of long term. But I think to Rosanna's point, I'm very aware, if you look at over the last few months in particular, some of our announcements about spend on jobs, and whether it was the £100 million that was announced by Fiona Hislop, there's phases to this. And in terms of specific numbers, obviously one of the first things that we can do when it comes to nature-based jobs is using our own public bodies. So Scottish Forestry and Forestry and Land Scotland already have apprenticeships. So can they expand their apprenticeship pool? And the same goes for Nature Scot. Now, those jobs are not going to come to an end at the end of this year's budget. So I am very conscious that when you're making commitments, budget commitments this year, people don't just disappear when the end of the financial year comes. So we do need to plan further ahead. And so we will be building in next year's budget on the commitments made this year, with a particular focus on jobs for the longer term, to give these public bodies, in the first instance, that security that they can provide jobs and make job offers.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to Claudia Beamish, who wants to pick up some issues around the financing of innovation. Claudia.
Yeah, thank you very much, Convener. And I'd like to explore, as the Convener says, some of these issues which are obviously fundamental to us going forward. And I just want to highlight, which both Cabinet Secretaries will be aware of, but for the public record, that the Green Recovery Inquiry responses to our committee identified many and often fundamental shortcomings of current economic and financial models in terms of their ability to provide the means of achieving a green, social and fair economic recovery coming out of COVID, and to also generate a shift to the wellbeing economy. So I'm very interested to explore with you both the funding for research, which is obviously fundamental not only, as has already been highlighted, in terms of the tech, but also research to show the directions that it's appropriate to be going in. And the National Investment Bank, if we could go back to that first, whether you see, although I respect the fact that it has an independence from government, but whether you see the possibilities of bringing in private investment as well into looking at innovation, and whether there should be conditionality on that and also on other government research and innovation schemes. Thank you.
Well, I kick off with the financing and the National Investment Bank. So the short answer is yes. So whilst the Scottish National Investment Bank will launch with £220 million of fresh seed funding, part of obviously the long-term £2 billion capitalisation pledge, we have it will as part of its efforts to make investments use that as leverage for private funding as well. Now, that obviously there's a number of caveats to that, but as the committee will know, we've been consulting on missions for the bank. We've already committed that the bank's primary mission will be to support the just transition to net zero, and we set out some of the areas that the bank may invest in as sort of illustrative within the consultation, whether that's low emission transport, power generation, commercial energy efficiency initiatives, and so on and so forth. But as Claudia says, once it's established, the bank will be operationally independent when it's making investment decisions, and it will be for the bank to determine how it will invest to meet those missions, and then there'll be a report to ministers, as you will know. So when it comes to the form of funding and the ability to leverage in private funding, the bank will develop its own investment strategy in response to the missions that we've been very clear about, and there will be that reporting mechanism. So that's the financing approach. But different forms of investment will require different funding. So there will be some where it's far more appropriate for the bank to use the public funding available. There'll be others where they may be able to work collaboratively with the private sector.
Thank you. Could I just ask you on that as well, in terms of the importance of research and innovation across all sectors for the green recovery? I wonder if Kate Forbes, you might be able to shed light on, is there, within the budget process, is there a process whereby all the different cabinet secretaries are able to discuss this? Because if we look at, say, agriculture and the marine environment and effects of wild salmon and the research needed there, or the circular economy, just to give two examples, and the design and redesign needed for remanufacturing. Sorry, not redesign, the design for remanufacturing that's needed. Is there a way in which we can be reassured that research really is high on the priority of your budget process? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'd answer that in two parts. The first is that, yes, it very much features, and it's one of those areas where actually that research might sit in different portfolios, but it's trying to deliver our ambitions across government when it comes to net zero. So there will be investment in research on the rural economy, within the education space, and within Rosanna Cunningham's space as well, all designed to see how we become more innovative and use our assets more sustainably. But we obviously we work closely with innovative and use our assets more sustainably. But we obviously we work closely with academic institutions to research and development capability, and we work closely with the Energy Technology Partnership, which is an alliance of world-class academic institutions in Scotland that encourages that collaboration that's needed between academia and industry to deliver research and development which assists the transition, particularly of our energy systems. And our support of that organisation includes funding for the Knowledge Exchange Network, which is a programme that helps Scottish universities ensure that their research is actually making an impact by using business development managers who specialise in different areas of low carbon energy to create partnerships between universities and industry. So that's an example where our funding can help that relationship between industry and academia to actually drive change. And I think it's that form of collaboration and partnership working that's actually going to make a difference. Whereas if we're just doing it in partnership with academia without bringing in industry, then it's not going to be as successful as it is working in that triangle. And we provide funding for in that case, the ETP's Energy Industry Doctorate Programme, which supports PhD projects that address decarbonisation challenges of industrial partners. So having gone in very narrow there in that answer, it gives you a tangible example of where we are providing the funding that drives change.
Right, thank you. That's helpful. I don't know if Rosanna wants to come back or to come in on that as well.
Yeah, I just thought in terms of being perhaps a little bit more specific on this issue, that just to flag up that we do have a strategic research programme that is, we invest around £48 million a year in that strategic research programme, and that provides important research for both my portfolio and for Fergus Ewing's portfolio, and we're currently in the process of developing the next research programme that will take us out to 2027. So clearly, global climate and nature crises are going to be a key driver of decisions around the research programme, and therefore there would be a corresponding focus on that, as well as supporting work on biodiversity. But I just thought that's perhaps a more specific part of the broader issue that Kate Forbes was talking about. So we are about to begin consulting on the next research programme that will take us out to 2027.
Right, thank you. That's very helpful. I'm sure the committee will have an interest in feeding into that consultation in whatever way is appropriate. Could I also ask, finally, from my perspective, about the National Performance Framework and how this can be used or is being developed to effectively track the green recovery, because there are already indicators which relate to our range of interests. And I wonder if perhaps you'd like to comment first, Rosanna, and then I don't know if more broadly if it's appropriate in relation to the budget and how it fits in with the budget, whether Kate would like to comment. Thank you.
Well, I mean, obviously the NPF does provide clear long-term purpose for government beyond just narrow economic success. And it does, I think, acknowledge that this is not just about government, it's about the whole of society, all sectors, public, private and third sector. The current indicators will provide high-level insight into the progress made towards a green recovery, but I think we would all accept that we've got to do a lot more to join up outcomes and spend. So there is work that's currently ongoing to increase the alignment of major policies and processes within the NPF, and that's including the PFG, budgets, reviews of spending, all of that to try and increase the alignment of that. so we do have to just be careful to get this right. Obviously, better linking money to outcomes is one part of that, and that's what we are looking very carefully at. There is a duty to consult on this, and I think it's a 5-yearly review and process for national outcomes for Scotland. The next review has to be initiated before June 2023, and planning is already in place to begin this work immediately after the elections next year. So that's under a 5-yearly review that is built into the process, and we are looking at the alignment at the moment, but we are also conscious that we have to start the review process, and that will begin soon after the elections.
Thank you. Could I just ask Kate briefly, though, if she wants to comment, or are we on a too tight?
Two very quick points, maybe. That's the foundation stone for our budget. So when it comes to setting the budget, the National Performance Framework is, as it were, the starting point for informing our budget. And we should be analysing the impact of our budgets on whether they've delivered against the National Performance Framework. And the second point is that obviously there's a number of different indicators. I'm sure none of us would disagree with any of them. The 3 that were brought to the fore in this year's programme for government are the 3 that will most heavily influence the budget, and those are new green jobs, good jobs. Secondly is dealing with inequality and supporting our communities, and the third is the health crisis.
Thank you. Can I bring Angus MacDonald briefly? Yes.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, convener. If I could just go back briefly to the issue of the research programmes. It's been well covered so far, but in recent years, particularly last year, there's been a particular concern regarding long-term funding and funding certainty for bodies such as the James Hutton Institute and other research organisations. I probably know the answer to this already, but is there any way that these organisations can get some greater certainty for the future with regard to funding?
Well, I'll answer that from a budget perspective, because I would suggest that concern is replicated in quite a number of different areas of government. So even if you look at, I'm not likening the two, I'm just going to make a point here about budget processes, that if you look at local authorities being able to plan several years in advance, if you look at a whole host of different organisations, public bodies, those that rely on government funding needing to plan several years in advance, we had very much hoped to be in a position to do a spending review, which is what is required in order to provide that long-term assurance on budgets. That is reliant on the UK government doing a spending review. Now, to be fair to the UK government, they have confirmed that they are going to be doing a comprehensive spending review this autumn, but I am highly sceptical that that will happen in light of the fact that they don't feel they can even provide certainty with a 1-year budget, never mind that long-term outlook. And so the bottom line for us is that we try very hard to provide long-term certainty where we can, but we can't do it unless there's long-term certainty for our own budget, because of the level of volatility in that budget. And so this, Rosanna may want to come in more specifically on those specific research programmes, but to make the point about the wider budget scenario right now, we cannot provide multi-year spending confirmation without multi-year spending confirmation for ourselves. It's an issue that is recognised by the UK government, which is why they've made steps to the comprehensive spending review this autumn. I just happen to be highly sceptical that it will be delivered.
I think in terms of the specific issue that Angus is raising about the research institutes, the 6 I think it is that are that are in Scotland, who every single one of them punch well above their weight in terms of their ability to deliver really, really good work. That we're back to the earlier question for a number of them, which is the issues around what is going to happen when and if EU funding disappears, because quite a lot of what they did actually drew down significant sums of money to be able to do the pieces of research. And there's a kind of more systemic problem as well, because that's their ability to, because most research projects don't get done on their own. They link up with other bodies elsewhere. The projects often span boundaries, and I know that a number of the research institutes are already running into difficulties because of the uncertainty. It means that projects with which they're involved are kind of dropping out of contention, or other partners are not keen on including a UK research arm of it because of that uncertainty. And so there are some extremely tricky issues. The other thing is that the research institutes, of course, are all constituted quite differently, and some have very specific challenges to meet. Others are perhaps not in that same position. They're not all constituted in the same way. They're not all they don't all work in the same way, and therefore there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to this. We actually have to work with some of the individual bodies. And I had hoped that through the cooperative work through Safari, that some of that would be able to be worked through in terms of them all sitting around the table, basically sharing understanding and sharing information. So that, I hope, is still something that can happen. But just so that people can understand, I mean, the research institutes range from the Royal Botanic Gardens to the likes of the Hutton. So we are talking a very widely different set of bodies here, and therefore the consequential difficulty of making a simple response that will apply to each and every one of them. However, they are all of them in that slightly difficult scenario of being accustomed to being part of research projects that span a number of different international bodies and individuals and what have you. And some of that is where some of the issues arise, and that won't really be resolved until we understand what is going to happen post-Brexit.
Thank you. We're going to move on to talk about preventative spend, and back to John Scott.
Thank you very much, Convener. And I just, before I start, welcome the Cabinet Secretary's commitment to sympathetically looking towards these research institutes, because the work that they do, much of it is about the future and therefore preventative spend. And in that regard, that is my particular interest, although I do note that in the themes that we've been given, there's a suggestion about collaborative working to reduce tax, and it would certainly occur to me that a tax collaboration between our governments could create, as it were, a fiscal structure to encourage preventative spend. I'm sure that idea has already been thought of, but it's a theme that I think is worth developing in terms of getting to net zero more quickly if it's incentivised in that way. But particularly, can I go on to ask about preventative spend, for example, and how collaboration across portfolios and public bodies is working? I understand there are 4 pilots now up and running, and perhaps Rosanna would like to talk about that, how that is working across portfolio and indeed green health partnerships.
Well, yeah, there is a lot of work in this area. I just want to remind people, and obviously there's been discussions on the committee on preventative spend in previous years. I just wanted to remind everybody of the generality that preventative spend has to come from somewhere. And while everybody agrees that it is a good thing, generally the agreement breaks down at the point where we're trying to transfer money into that from somewhere else, and that's just a reality of where we are. I think there's been quite a lot of to and fro with the committee about preventative spend, and so there's a lot that can be said. If I just go to the very specific issue that was raised by John Scott about the 4 pilot green health partnerships, they've been established. They're in Dundee, Highland, Lanarkshire and North Ayrshire. And they're there in order to try and demonstrate cross-sectoral coordination and the way that it can mainstream approaches to increasing physical activity and improving mental health through engagement with the natural environment. And we've seen over this period, this last 6 months, how much more to the fore that has become in general understanding and general conversation. I think perhaps prior to that, it wouldn't generally have been a topic of widespread popular discussion, but it has become so. The very first one that was set up was the Lanarkshire one, and it has now been in operation for 2 years, and it does show how much has been achieved to integrate green health into health and social care. The Year 2 report was published in March this year, and it did conclude that substantial progress had actually been made, and achievement towards the outcomes that were set out in the evaluation framework at the start. The term green health, I think, is becoming more recognised and valued, and awareness of the range of activities within Lanarkshire has risen considerably. So we would regard the one that's been most long-standing as being a success. There's work being commissioned from Napier University to undertake some research. So we're back to the research idea into these pilot partnerships, and that work is actually available on the Nature Scott website, so people could go and have a look at that if they wish. It did conclude that promoting the use of the natural environment is a good strategic fit, obviously, with not just with public health priorities, and it does provide a strong, powerful voice. I think it's really important, and this year that we have just gone through probably brings home much more forcefully to people how incredibly important it can be. I guess it probably is not overstating it to say that during the hard lockdown, that the ability to get out and connect with nature was what really saved a lot of people. And there be, we did then see develop a very, very lively conversation about the difference between those people who were able to access that easily and those for whom it was more difficult. So there's still a lot of work to do, but we are, undertaking evaluation and research as we go along to make sure that it is delivering what we thought it would deliver. And the outcome so far is that yes, it does. Obviously, there's a lot more that this is very much that's very much focused on the particular location in terms of health. There's other aspects to preventative spend that we have talked about previously in this committee as well. And I just go back to what I said at the outset, that it is an area of spend that everybody broadly agrees with, everybody signs up to, until the point at which you begin to move lines of the budget around, and then there becomes a rather more stressful conversation about how that is to be managed.
And speaking of which, and the suggestion I'm going to make might not necessarily make that any better for you, although it's rarely that I find myself in agreement with Rosanna, but I do agree with her utterly about matters of health and well-being and preventative spend. And I found that hugely in my own case, the importance of well-being and green spaces. And that is there any way that that could be recognised more in the environment budget? I feel quite protective about that in the same way that you do, Rosanna. And therefore, are you in a position, shall we say, to ask Jean Freeman if she would like to give up some of her budget to you with regard to the good deeds that you do for her in terms of the well-being that your budget provides and help to hers, or indeed some of the COVID budgets that have come from the UK government that might be less contentious if some of that was allocated to your budget rather, or at least shared with your budget than going elsewhere. Discuss.
Well, that is challenging in the current circumstances for very obvious reasons. That we are still very much struggling with managing this, and I'll undertake to ensure that Jean Freeman is aware that there would be wider support for this. I would never want to miss an opportunity to increase my budget in any way, shape or form, as Kate Forbes will undoubtedly be able to confirm. But there are, as John Scott knows, a great many challenges, even for a relatively small budget like mine. There are a great many more calls on the budget than the budget is actually currently capable of being able to deliver. So that bigger conversation is quite challenging. It is a conversation that we have had and will continue to have. I can reassure John Scott that it's not one that is being forgotten about.
Thanks.
Can I bring in Mark Ruskell, who has some questions around preventative spend?
Yeah, it was about preventative spending more generally, really, Convener. I mean, one way to bake in preventative spending approach across the whole budget process would be to ensure that financial budgets have to take consideration of environmental principles, like the precautionary principle. So we're not just creating problems that we're then spending money trying to solve further down the line. Is that something the government's considered? Because there clearly is an opportunity to do that with a continuity bill.
Well, I come in on that in terms of, it's a fair question, and I think you could probably apply that if your concern is preventative spend in the sense of not increasing the cost of something further down the line. That is definitely a principle that needs to be applied right across the board, so including on the environmental element. So, I mean, I would say that it certainly is considered in terms of, if you take infrastructure spend, what the environmental impact might be, and therefore what additional mitigation needs to be costed and then ultimately spent in the long term. So, I mean, it's factored in the round when it comes to any analysis of spend, but it's maybe something I'll take that away and have some thought, give it some thought in terms of how it perhaps needs to be baked in a little bit more strongly when it comes to preventative spend. I mean, the bottom line, as Rosanna said, when it comes to preventative spend, and I should say that last year's budget was, as part of my commitment to try and increase the focus on preventative spend, all portfolios were required to link their spend to outcomes and the National Performance Framework to demonstrate that it was actually delivering. And this year's budget, I can't overemphasize how challenging next year's budget is going to be. I'm sure every finance secretary has said that since 1999. Next year's budget must surely be the most challenging one to set thus far because of the demands on our budget and the lack of clarity. So in that context, for the budget to be sustainable, for our public finances to be sustainable, we need to ensure that we get preventative spend right. But my appeal to Parliament would be to scrutinise the budget in that way also, because as Rosanna says, the difficulty, every budget that's published, the instant focus is on budgets that have been cut or been reduced. Now, you cannot proceed with preventative spending as a principle without being able to move budget around. And ultimately, that budget will be displayed, it will be aligned to one portfolio. That does not mean it's not delivering results or outcomes or benefits in another portfolio. But I think probably both in the way that we set our budget and the way that it's scrutinised, if we're going to take preventative spend seriously, then we need to be a little bit more mature in how we demonstrate that and how we display that in the budget document.
You're happy with that, Mark? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. Just checking before we bring the session to an end. Stuart, did you have some additional questions around innovation that you wanted? Are you quite happy with the response? I'm just double checking. Okay, that's fine. Well, thank you very much. That looks like it's all our areas of questioning have been covered. I want to thank both Cabinet Secretaries and their officials for their time this morning. We'll move on to our next agenda item. Our second item today is a consideration of a notification from the Scottish Government in relation to consent to UK statutory instruments, the Air Quality Amendment, Northern Ireland EU exit regulations. Members will recall there's an agreed protocol between the Scottish Government and the Parliament in relation to instruments being made by the UK Government under powers in the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, which relate to proposals within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Government and Parliament have agreed on a UK-wide approach to statutory instruments, for example, to avoid duplication of effort or where only technical or minor amendments are required. Do any members have any comments in relation to this instrument? If you'd like to let me know in our chat box and I can come to you, I'll give you a couple of seconds to do that. No, I'm not seeing any members wanting to come in. So are members content to write to the Scottish Government to confirm the committee's content for consent to be given for the UK SI referred to in the notification? Simple. Thumbs up or nodding will suffice. I'm seeing everyone nodding. Thank you very much. Right, we're content to write to the Scottish Government. We'll then move on to agenda item 3. Our third item is to consideration of the Climate Change Duties of Public Bodies Reporting Requirements Scotland Amendment Order 2020. It's a negative instrument. And I believe that a couple of members do have some comments in relation to this instrument. Can I come to Mark Ruskell first of all?
Yeah, thanks, convener. I'm content with this instrument. It's obviously extremely important. However, I did have a query, and I wondered if it might be appropriate for us as a committee to write back to the government on this. And it's in relation to the proposed responsibilities of the Environmental Standards Scotland body, which we're considering at the moment with the Continuity Bill. And I wanted to understand how this proposed body would work effectively with this public sector reporting duty. My understanding is that in relation to climate change, the proposed ESS does not have a direct responsibility. It's more kind of our committee that has that responsibility in relation to targets. But it does have a role in relation to adaptation, which these reports, this reporting duty will also relate to. There seems to be a little bit of confusion there about the kind of governance of public sector body reporting in relation to climate change, and in particular, what the role of ESS would be, if any, in relation to these reports and ensuring that we all go forward and tackle the climate emergency.
Thank you. And Claudia Beamish also has a comment to make.
Right, thank you, convener. And it would be helpful if the committee were in agreement, if we could also write for some clarification about something that is highlighted in relation to the instrument, there was a short life collaborative working group convened by the Scottish Government to carry out a review of the reporting duties. And one of the areas of exploration was, and I quote, the procurement sections currently provide little meaningful data and do not effectively monitor how procurement policies are contributing to emissions reduction. And is so important within the public sector. I think it would be helpful if we could ask for clarification about how this has been developed and what the expectations are within this instrument. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm getting that we are content on the whole, but we have a couple of queries that we'd like to write to the government about. So if members are content, we'll cover both comments made by Mark Ruskell and Claudia Beamish in a letter to send to the Scottish Government. Okay, thank you all. At our next meeting on the 27th of October, we will consider draft reports on the Scottish Government's budget 2021-2022 and on the committee's Green Recovery inquiry. But that concludes the public part of our meeting today. Thank you all.